Welcome to the Worldview Media channel. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe and click the notification icon so you won't miss future episodes. What does God have to do with the discussion about space, technology, and Elon Musk? Well, more than you might think. Keep watching to find out. We'll get back to Elon Musk a bit later. But Yuri Gagarin, the Russian cosmonaut who was the first man in space, was also the first man to mention God in space. After getting into orbit, he was reported to have said, "I see no God up here." Since then, some people have suggested that these weren't his words at all, but just an atheistic propaganda statement released by the Kremlin. This was the middle of the Cold War. The Cold War wasn't just a competition between nuclear powers. It was also a battle between competing ideologies. Atheistic communism on one hand, capitalism on the other, the power of the state on one hand, and the power of free enterprise on the other. Yuri Gagarin's atheistic propaganda was intended as a slap in the face to religion, but it was pretty much the beginning and the end of atheism in space. John Glenn, the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth, testified to how that wondrous experience had inspired his faith in God. He said it was like seeing the face of God. When the Apollo 8 mission entered orbit of the Moon on Christmas Eve, 1968, the three American astronauts marked that special event of seeing the whole Earth rise above the lunar horizon for the first time by reading from the book of Genesis. Another lesser-known fact is that during the Apollo 11 mission, when astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the Moon on July 16, 1969, one of the first things they did after safely landing was to pray and take Holy Communion, a fact that NASA didn't disclose until decades later. During later Apollo missions, several astronauts testified to having spiritual experiences and even answered prayers as they worked through technical problems during their time on the Moon. Apollo 15 astronaut James Irwin was the 8th man to walk on the Moon and the first to ride the lunar rover. He was having trouble with a planned experiment. Frustrated in his attempts to get the equipment assembled, Irwin decided to pray. He'd been raised in a Christian home, but at this stage of his life, he'd neglected his faith as he busied himself with his exciting and demanding career. But due to the nature of the problem that he was having on the Moon, he said, "God, I need your help right now." Suddenly, Irwin experienced the presence of Jesus in a remarkable way, unlike anything he'd ever felt on Earth. He testified that the Lord showed him the solution to the problem, and he was so overwhelmed at feeling God's immediate presence that he actually turned around just to see if Jesus was actually standing behind him. This encounter with Christ on the Moon changed Irwin's life, and he went on to become an evangelical minister. Apollo 16 astronaut Charles Duke, the 10th and youngest man to walk on the Moon in 1972, went on to surrender his life to Christ a few years later and devoted himself to Christian service. And recently, Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the Moon, also a committed Christian, renewed calls to establish permanent manned bases on the Moon and Mars. The current head of NASA, Jim Bridenstine, is also a committed Christian. He recently announced NASA's new objective to return to the Moon and establish permanent manned bases there. They plan to achieve this by partnering with a number of other private companies in their mission to get back to the Moon, onto Mars, and beyond. This brings us to Elon Musk. Who is he? He's the founder of SpaceX and CEO of Tesla and a whole lot of other companies that you've probably heard of.
Do you believe in God?
I believe there's some explanation for this universe, which you might call God.
The South African-born tech billionaire was Robert Downey Jr.'s inspiration for his portrayal of Tony Stark, Iron Man, in the Hollywood Avengers franchise. Musk even had a cameo role in one of the movies. Musk, along with the other co-founders of PayPal, became multimillionaires when PayPal was sold to eBay for $1.5 billion in 2002. Musk became instantly extremely wealthy, and he said he could have retired to his own personal island. But instead, he chose to get busy with a number of high-risk business ventures, designed not so much for profit, but for the highly altruistic mission. In his words, global existential risk mitigation, or in other words, saving the world. In Musk's mind, he's pursuing a two-pronged strategy for the benefit of humanity. One is to help the world make an accelerated transition away from fossil fuels to sustainable energy. And the other is to help increase humanity's chance for survival by becoming a multi-planet species. But as rich as Musk became from the sale of PayPal, $165 million wasn't going to be enough to achieve those lofty goals. If he was going to have any chance of making progress, he was going to have to somehow leverage his influence to achieve disproportionate outcomes. Initially, he was willing to risk half of that fortune and to set out to try to reignite interest in the space program. To that end, he traveled to Russia to try and buy a used intercontinental ballistic missile. His initial idea was fairly modest: to fire the modified missile to Mars with a greenhouse as a payload, and to broadcast those images back to Earth in the hope that this picture of life on Mars would rally and inspire interest for future manned missions to the Red Planet. But his idea struck a snag when he found the Russians uncooperative and the missile unreasonably expensive. But instead of abandoning his idea, he set out to educate himself on what it would take to design, manufacture, and launch his own rocket. It took him more than half of his fortune, about $100 million, and 3 failed attempts before a Falcon rocket finally achieved orbit, making it the first privately funded venture to ever achieve that goal. Since then, SpaceX has advanced in leaps and bounds, winning lucrative contracts for delivering supplies to the International Space Station and launching private satellites. At the time of publishing, SpaceX is valued at an estimated $30 billion. Not a bad return on investment so far. And consistent with Musk's goal of making spaceflight affordable, SpaceX has gained the competitive edge by perfecting the retrieval and reuse of first-stage Falcon 9 boosters. He has also used those boosters to develop an even larger heavy-lift vehicle capable of carrying heavy satellites into orbit and large payloads to Mars. In 2018, he did a demonstration launch of this vehicle by using his own Tesla Roadster as the payload. And as if that weren't enough, SpaceX is developing an even bigger fully reusable rocket called Starship, capable of taking hundreds of people and cargo to Mars. And it's actually being built right now. SpaceX claims that Starship will be fully reusable with no refurbishment required between flights, and that it can be used for point-to-point transport on Earth, reaching any destination within 30 minutes. And when used for interplanetary flight, it will be able to launch into Earth orbit, rendezvous with a refueling ship, then blast off for Mars, where there will be habitat and cargo already waiting to sustain a human colony. Well, that's the plan. But how do you finance such an expensive project? Well, Elon seems to have that all figured out too. SpaceX has just embarked on another ambitious plan to launch 12,000 satellites into low Earth orbit to provide fast, low-cost broadband internet access all over the world, including very remote locations. The first deployment of these satellites has already begun. This promises to be highly disruptive to existing internet providers and has the potential to make Elon Musk and SpaceX astronomically wealthy. One thing you need to understand about this is that for Elon Musk, these ventures are not primarily about making money. He obviously doesn't need to get rich. But every one of Musk's ambitious projects seems designed to play a vital role in his altruistic grand plan, making life better on Earth and establishing a human colony on another world. So let me spell it out for you. SpaceX. To get to Mars, you obviously need rockets, but you need cheaper, reusable rockets, and you need big, heavy lift rockets, and you need to make them commercially viable. When you get to Mars, you need power. Since there's no fossil fuels to burn, you need solar power and battery storage capability. When you get to Mars, you need habitat to live in. Underground habitat makes the most sense. It provides protection from solar radiation and provides thermal insulation.
So yeah, the companies are not, we're not joined, but we do share technologies and capabilities wherever we can. In fact, I think the Boring Company could be the way that we house people on Mars.
On Mars, you also need transportation, and all of that has to be electric. On Mars, as well as here on Earth, Musk believes that we'll need to employ as much advanced technology as we can to remain competitive and useful to offset what he sees as the growing existential threat posed by artificial intelligence. And finally, to do all this, you need a way to pay for it. You also need advanced satellite communication arrays to remain in communication with Earth. So that's Musk's grand plan so far, and I have no doubt that there's much more to it than is currently in the public domain. But one thing that I've observed is that whilst Musk has a habit of doing a lot of crazy things for fun, like launching his Tesla into space, like naming the ships on which his rockets land at sea, things like, "Of course I still love you," and "Just read the instructions," and selling flamethrowers to raise money for the Boring Company. He rarely does anything without it somehow playing a pivotal role in that overall grand plan. So all of this makes me wonder, could God be using a man like Elon Musk to open up a new chapter for humanity? If humans ever do succeed in establishing human colonies on the Moon and Mars, will we ever get to the point where we're sending evangelists and missionaries to those extraterrestrial communities? So what do you make of all this? Is this quest for the stars just the hubris of men striving to exalt themselves above God? Is this like the Tower of Babel all over again? For those of you who may not know the biblical story, the Bible gives an account of an event that took place in ancient times where mankind came together for an extraordinary project. They proposed building a city with a tower that ascended all the way to heaven, and with the proud goal of making a name for themselves. And the Bible tells us that the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing they propose to do now will be impossible for them. Let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." And so the Lord dispersed them from there all over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. I find this passage so very interesting, because God himself is acknowledging that when people are organized and cooperative, nothing is impossible for them, and that this grand vision of theirs was only the beginning. Apparently, God's intervention at that time was purposed to slow the technological progress of man. Interestingly, later in the Bible, the prophet Daniel gets a vision from God about what the world will look like in the last days, and it's this: "Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." Nothing describes the time in which we are currently living better than this. You could argue that the Apollo 11 mission, which was broadcast to the world, was another Tower of Babel moment that could have gone terribly, terribly wrong.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And whilst it didn't go well for the man who first proposed it, the millions of people who did live to see it were inspired as those American astronauts rode that rocket to the moon, bathed in the goodwill, best wishes, and prayers of the entire planet. So, how will all this end? Will this Mars venture just be another Tower of Babel moment in human history? Will Musk be like Icarus of Greek mythology, who ignored his father's warning and flew too close to the sun, only to come tumbling down? Or will this be a new source of inspiration for the world, and something that actually fulfills God's plan and purpose for humanity, and somehow also fits into Bible prophecy? Here's a question for my Christian friends. Do you think Jesus will come back before any of this happens? Or might this be pointing to a grand new chapter of human history in which Christians will continue to play a central part, just as they have in the past when those tall sailing ships set sail to explore the world and establish new colonies and nations that no one had ever dreamed of? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. And please remember to subscribe, click the notification icon, and share this story with your friends. Thanks for watching.